To our next speaker, our speakers. I'm so excited to have them here as we're moving towards the conclusion for our afternoon, and then we're going to open up for some dialogue. My dear friend, someone who's been walking this road at the intersection of faith and public life with me for a long time now, Mara Vanderslice Kelly, is the Executive Director of the United Way Center on Human Trafficking and Slavery. Ms. Vanderslice Kelly joined the team at United Way Worldwide in 2014 to help them launch a strategic initiative to combat human trafficking. The center will be formally launched later this summer and aims to catalyze unprecedented cross-sector collaboration and build the public and political will needed to scale the fight to end human trafficking and slavery. Prior to joining United Way, Ms. Vanderslice Kelly served in President Obama's administration for 5 years. She served as Deputy Director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and Senior Policy Advisor to the White House Domestic Policy Council. During her tenure in the White House, she coordinated the President's Advisory Council for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and facilitated the production of the Advisory Council's report entitled Building Partnerships to Eradicate Modern Slavery that presented recommendations directly to the President on these issues. Prior to her work in government, Ms. Vanderslice Kelly ran a consulting firm that worked with public officials, political candidates, and nonprofit organizations to engage America's diverse faith communities. She has worked on 6 statewide Senate races in the 2008 Obama campaign. She and her husband, John Kelly, reside in Washington, D.C., where they are avid, some might even say rabid Nats fans, and so go Nationals. She's going to be joined in this conversation by Allison Kiehl Friedman, who is the Vice President of the Global Fund to End Slavery. Prior to joining the fund, Ms. Friedman was Deputy Director of the U.S. State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, where she oversaw that office's international programs and public engagement and reports and political affairs section. This is a critically important role in this work, and Allison did a tremendous job in the administration leading it. Her teams were collectively responsible for managing over $40 million in anti-trafficking programs in 37 countries around the world, chairing the U.S. government's coordinating body for interagency trafficking work and the department's annual Trafficking in Persons report and related diplomatic engagement. Allison also served as senior advisor to the ambassador at large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, where she helped to conceive and launch slaveryfootprint.org, which we heard a little bit about last night from Justin, and also Executive Order 16327, which strengthened protections against trafficking in person in federal contracts. All of this is really important. I want to read the entire bio, but that executive order basically, in the same way that Justin and Slavery Footprint are seeking to get rid of trafficking in private supply chains, the work that they did in government sought to rid our federal supply chains of human trafficking as well. It's really important work. Earlier, Ms. Friedman was Executive Director of the Alliance to Stop Slavery and End Trafficking, ASSET, where she was instrumental in the passage of the California Supply Chain Transparency Act, a first-of-its-kind law that requires companies doing business in California to publicly disclose what anti-slavery policies and monitoring mechanisms they have put in place. She served as District Director for former U.S. Representative Jane Harmon, California Policy Director for People for the American Way, and the National Student Director for the Gore-Lieberman 2000 presidential campaign. Ms. Friedman is a native of the National Capital Area and a graduate of Stanford University and lives in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Mara and Allison.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hasn't this been so much fun? I feel like it's a huge reunion. So many beautiful, powerful, inspiring faces here, and I just want to thank Joshua and the Freedom Center for doing this event. It has been deeply, truly, emotionally moving for me, so thank you. And I'm going to turn over to my dear friend Allison to get us started.
Great. I'm just going to set up Mara, and then Mara's going to tell us what we can all do together. So our presentation is really about putting the values behind, finding the value behind the values. And let's go forward. You've heard a lot this morning about how big the problem is, how strong the support is, and I would submit to you that there are very few global, national, or even community leaders who won't spend a lot of time talking about how much they care about this issue. But when you look at implementation of laws and the resources devoted to this, they're woefully inadequate. So as much as we've spent the morning talking about how traffickers are really motivated by economics and profit, and money, I would submit to you that you can tell a government's motivations by where they spend their money. So let's look at that. In the 2014 federal budget, we spent $77.2 million for wild horse and burro protection in the western United States. $23 million printing the congressional record, which is available online, and the Government Accountability Office admits is largely thrown away. $25.1 billion combating drug trafficking, and $11 million promoting California prunes, almonds, and raisins around the world. Anybody care to guess what the US federal government's budget is on human trafficking? $71.9 million in 2014, with $30 million going to promoting freedom around the world, $14.3 million promoting justice within the United States, and a little under $10 million for health and human service programs for survivor services. So let's compare the two. I think the numbers speak for themselves, but when we're spending 10 times more per donkey than we are per human, and 0.2% combating human trafficking as we are combating drug trafficking, the priorities in the federal government are off. When I first started working on this issue, I went to the UN and talked to a number of UN officials who had been working on, who had helped create the Global Fund to fight AIDS. And I asked them, you know, how did you do that? Because we need something like this for human trafficking. You heard about the incredible work that Monica and A21 do, and I will tell you, having been in the State Department, every single year we put out a request for proposals. We would make the decision about which countries could no longer have shelters because we didn't have enough money to fund a shelter, and in many countries they didn't have enough money to fund their own, and we knew that if you only fund shelters, you don't solve the problem. And so I asked the UN official, how do we do this? And he said, you won't be able to. Here's the difference between me and you. Powerful people had loved ones who were dying of AIDS. If you are a trafficking victim, by your very nature, you are not connected to anybody in power, except, of course, your trafficker. You will never get the money. And then I talked to a friend of mine who was a political consultant. He said, I heard about this issue, and I actually stayed and watched through the commercial because I couldn't believe that there was a senator who would engage on this issue when there's no voting base that cares about it. So we spend, and as bad as the funding is in the United States, it's worse globally. We spend $124 million versus $150 billion in profits. It's uncoordinated. And because all of the amazing people from Brooke to Monica to A21 are spending their time dealing with direct services because that's what you can do, there isn't additional money to look at data and monitoring and reporting and what works and scaling. And the business sector is largely not engaged. There is, however, hope. And I think Mara will speak to that more. This year, Senator Corker introduced a bill that would authorize $250 million of funding over 7 years to incentivize the creation of a fund, equal parts funded by the private sector and the public sector, that would require rigorous goals and measurement, country ownership, to actually look at what meaningfully addressing this issue would be. And they are currently seeking other Senate co-sponsors, and there's been large-scale bipartisan support for this initiative. But the reality is this has historically been a political issue born out of a personal commitment by individual political actors and not out of a groundswell of support for the human trafficking issue. And now I'll turn it over to Mara.
Well, so thanks everyone. As Joshua knows, I mean, you know, when we were working together in the White House in the faith-based office, we knew that this was an issue that was really welling up for the faith community, and particularly for young Christians around the country, and we decided that we wanted to get more into looking at it. And so we asked our advisory council of religious and nonprofit leaders to look at this issue, and we spent about 1.5 years meeting with amazing leaders and organizers that did incredible direct service work. And it was like we wanted to support every single one of them. Every single one of them had one piece of the solution, and we're doing amazing work. But you might have a shelter that was here. I'll tell the story very quickly, but in 2003 and 2004, we organized voters in Iowa to ask all of the presidential candidates to support $30 billion to fight HIV/AIDS in Africa. And through that process, we got every single presidential candidate to commit to $30 billion, both Democrats and Republicans, and that later became PEPFAR. And part of President Bush's commitment to fight AIDS would still give $7.5 billion a year in fighting AIDS overseas. And we have knocked over that disease. We've brought back sub-Saharan Africa from the grips of the AIDS crisis. I believe, with the power of people like this in the room, we can do exactly the same thing on the trafficking issue, and it starts here. So we are going, at United Way, with a group of the top anti-trafficking NGOs in the country, are going to launch a campaign to ask the 2016 presidential candidates to increase our investments, address slavery and supply chains, and improve domestic policies to increase support for survivors. We are saying, what would it look like if we spent 2 cents of every dollar that traffickers make in profits to combat trafficking? $3 billion. So we're going to ask the candidates to commit to $3 billion a year to help us scale this fight to end trafficking. And we're going to go to domestic programs and $1.5 billion to be our contribution to international programs. And it needs to include support for increasing victim identification, interventions and rescues, full wraparound trauma-informed survivor services, beefing up our budgets for law enforcement and prosecution, addressing slavery and supply chains, and then I think most importantly for this conversation, talking about prevention. How do we actually prevent these kids from getting in these situations in the first place? And every single part of this wheel needs to be funded and brought to scale. And so many groups are saying, oh, well, we just need to do this piece, or we just need to do this piece. No, we need to do the whole piece. And the way that we get there is by using our moral voice, our feet, our vote, and you all in this room, I believe, can be the ones that here today can start changing the tide on this problem, changing history. If we all agree to take this on together, ask our leaders to stand up and do what they need to do to get to break the back of slavery in our generation. So we'd like you to join us.
Excellent, guys. Thank you so much. So let me just tell you, if the Progressive National Baptist Convention and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference and the Southern Baptist Convention and the National Association of Evangelicals and the United Church of Christ and some other folks that I see represented sitting here in this room walked into any senator's office together, after they picked their jaws up off the floor, they would listen very closely to what you had to say. And particularly if you approach them with an issue like this, not both on the global side, but also on the domestic side, talking about the connective tissue to education, to healthcare, to addiction, and so forth. And if we can unite our voices around some of these key issues, we can both expand our capacity on direct service, but also bring some of these solutions to scale as well. That is something worth thinking more about. And Mara and Allison, thank you for setting the table and giving an opportunity for voices to connect with you and amplify your work, hopefully, in the future.